Well, let's reconvene, and we're going this afternoon's program. We're going to have two parts. First part is going to be a chance to have a conversation with Ash Carter, and then Ash has to leave by about 3 or 3:05 to be precise, and then after that. Liz Sherwood and Karen Dumfried and I will have a trilateral discussion, trying to pick up some of the themes of the afternoon topic.
You're going to get outsmarted, Joe.
Oh, absolutely, I'd say. And I'm used to that, but I grew up with three sisters, so all my life I've been a minority. But in any case, we're very lucky to have Ash here. I'm not going to take a lot of time on his biography because our time is short, but of course, most recently he was Secretary of Defense for 2 years, 2015 to 17, and has just returned to Harvard and to the Kennedy School as director of the Belfer Center. But I can remember Ash when he was a young researcher at the Belfer Center before he became so august and distinguished as he's been. He's held just about every position in the Defense Department you can think of, from number one down to whatever the lowest level researcher is where he started. But the thing I want to leave you with to think about before he talks to us is that Ash has a degree in physics, which everybody knows and remembers, but he also has a degree in medieval history, and that's why he was so good at the Pentagon. In any case, let me turn it over to my friend and colleague, Ash Carter.
Thank you. Joe, thanks very much, and lots of good friends here. I see many familiar faces and distinguished people. Joe, to my left especially, yes, Joe is a big reason I got into this area in the first place, watching what he had done in public service and admiring him and then learning from him for many years about many issues, but to include Russia and Europe. Should I say a few things about where I'll talk about the defense relationship with Russia, which is virtually the only relationship there is between the United States and Russia, the political and economic being much attenuated. The military one is attenuated also in positive ways that we once upon a time had more of. And I'll just say, before I say what I'm going to say about Russia, which is what I'm going to say is that we're required to stand strong against today's Russia, and that was what I thought was important as Secretary of Defense, and also what I advised and supported within NATO as well. That hasn't always been the case, and just so you know where I'm coming from, I know a different time in the 1990s, and Joe was a big part of this, Liz was a big part of this, where I worked very closely with the Russians, including the Russian military. I had responsibility for the Nunn-Lugar program, which was our way of contributing to a really Russian-led effort to secure the weapons of mass destruction legacy of the former Soviet Union. And we're very proud of our role in that, but the ones who get credit for that are principally the military and the custodians in Russia and the other states who rose to the solemnity of the duty of being custodians of nuclear weapons and nuclear materials, and the gravity of that responsibility in those days, and to whom the world owes a very great deal. We worked with them closely, but it was their accomplishment, not ours. It was theirs. I worked with, and I have great pictures of Liz and I with Pavel Grachev, the defense minister of Russia in the 90s, when we successfully engineered a way to get the Russians to be part of KFOR in Kosovo. A way that worked for our and NATO's important military principle of unity and command, unity of command, while meeting Russia's political need not to be seen to be totally subordinated to NATO. We went through the difficult period, and I know this is one of the things that was sent to me as a question or still being discussed. There's almost no point in talking about it now. It's long in the past, but about NATO enlargement, I'll just say two things about it. It's long. I personally would have favored and did favor some delay and a longer period of Partnership for Peace. For those of you who remember what Partnership for Peace was, that would have been a wiser course. It was not the course taken. As a consequence, it became, NATO's enlargement became a lasting source of grievance, much exploited by Vladimir Putin in the years since. And also, from a military point of view, exposed us as a defensive alliance on the flanks in a way that's very hard to compensate for, and we work very hard at doing that, and I think there are ways that we can do that, but it's not a pleasant military challenge to have. We find ourselves, therefore, in the circumstances now of Vladimir Putin, a substantial climate of grievance, and a very definite point of view, which has some sense to it here and there, but a very definite point of view on his part, which he shares freely. I've frequently asked, and Joe, you and Liz and others may be as well, what is Vladimir Putin thinking? And it's a favorite question to ask. And my answer is you don't need to ask me. You guys just listen to him. Tells you exactly what he's thinking. And there's the grievance point. There is the view that the United States has made a hash of things. This is particularly true in the Middle East. I have a good friend, Boogie Alon, the defense minister formerly of Israel, who was fond of saying that it's easy to make an omelet out of an egg and very hard to make an egg out of an omelet. And so when you take apart a country, even with the best of intentions, you quickly find that you have unleashed things that are very difficult to contain. Putin makes that point insistently, and so in most cases I can see the reason behind what he is up to, and you could think of a way of building a bridge to that, which is very difficult to build. The motivation of his that it's very difficult to build a bridge to, and I never succeeded, and I don't think it's possible, is the motivation that takes satisfaction from thwarting the United States as an end in its own right. And obviously, it's hard to build a bridge to that kind of motivation, and he definitely has that. That being the case, the phrase I used as Secretary of Defense was strong and balanced. Our strategy towards Russia, strength, and that means it means a lot of things, but one of them, for example, is having for the first time in a quarter century a plan to go to war with Russia, which we kind of didn't have for 25 years, and we do now. And that's not something we discuss a lot, but it is a necessity of current times. True for NATO as well. This is not a rewriting of the playbook of the Cold War. That wouldn't be appropriate. It's not the Fulda Gap, and it's a new playbook that takes into account hybrid warfare and the little green men phenomena and lots of cyber and lots of other things that are characteristic of modern warfare and the exposed flanks. for that matter. It means in our own investment programs doing things that are specifically oriented towards the defeat of Russian weapon systems. Again, not something we did for quite a while. And of course, we had a tremendous preoccupation with counterinsurgency and counterterrorism for 15 years, or returning to great power roots. A whole other story on China, Iran, North Korea, and others as well, but certainly Russia's among them. And some positioning of U.S. forces in NATO in new and different ways. That's the U.S. unilateral side. And then for NATO, putting Russia and deterrence of Russian aggression solidly on the NATO map. Again, not something that was on NATO's radar screen. And part of its story of why it existed, it would say, well, that's not why we exist. We exist because of Afghanistan or something like that. Or we exist because of Kosovo. Now it exists because of Russia. And NATO's willing to say that. And I think that's important and it's necessary. And at the same time, of course, NATO's about other things. It's still about Afghanistan. It's about its southern flank. But it's about the eastern flank as well. So that's strength, and it all starts there. And Joe was asking me earlier something you may want to ask later about the Russian cyber intrusions. But this is now a necessity of our time in defense and within NATO. Balanced, because I always try to hold open, and when I spoke publicly and when I talked to Russians about this, the possibility that where we found common interest, we would be willing to work together. We're realistic. We need to be realistic. Those are few and far between. A little bit on Iran in the nuclear area. Successfully, I thought. The Russians did the right thing. In the old days, North Korea, Russians aren't very helpful now and actually don't matter as much as they wish they did. But other than that, certainly Syria, don't get me started. I'll tell you stories on Syria. Ukraine, war in general, and the threats of war, brandishing nuclear weapons, building odd and weird new types and numbers of nuclear weapons, speaking in a way that Leonid Brezhnev never would have about nuclear weapons, and that leaders in the nuclear age generally have not. And of course, hacking the U.S. presidential election, which they damn well did. Tried to do. Their level of success is murkier, and the involvement of Americans in it is a whole other question. But what's absolutely clear is that they tried. So all that is a pretty big hill to climb for those who want to do something in U.S.-Russian relations. At the same time, I think it's important to hold the door open, however conditionally. And so strong and balanced is the way to go. That was what I tried to do. We'll see what the new crowd does. I don't think they've settled down to anything that is intelligible yet. And we'll just have to see what comes out of that. Hasn't been much policy making with respect to Russia. I don't imagine there will be soon, because the Mueller investigation, I think, makes it very difficult to move.
Ash, when it comes to deterring Russia, we know how to do conventional deterrence. Putting in an extra brigade and having them sort of toe to heel in the Baltics. That's something we know how to do, and it seems to have had some effect. Do we know how to deter Russian involvement in Western elections and politics? This came up in the lunch session with former Foreign Minister Ana Palacio, and the question of whether the Russians were messing about in Catalonia. We know that they were messing about in our 2016 election. How do we deter that?
Well, it's a very good question, Joe, and I think the basics of it are that that is not a question that can be answered adequately within its own frame. The only way that you can respond to and thereby deter actions by Russia is by having a wider defense and deterrence policy than the one we have now. And you do these things where there's a larger context of strength and ability to dole out threats and rewards. When you have attenuated that, to the point that it is now attenuated, our toolbox is, I mean, everybody wants to respond. You're not asking this, Joe, but the standard thing people want when they ask that question is, tell me the cyber thing I should do in response to a cyber thing. I'm not a cyber for cyber person. Somebody attacks the United States, they've attacked the United States. I don't care whether you did it with cyber or not. And I don't confine myself, and we don't confine ourselves in our military thinking to a cyber response. You might get anything. To do that while keeping peace, that is outside of war, you need to be operating from a richer pattern of strength and interaction than we are now. So the answer is it's difficult to stop them from doing any one particular thing unless you have the pattern.
Could
And the pattern
Obama
isn't
have
there.
done more?
Yes.
Yeah.
No question. It's not a criticism. You can always do more. And if Liz had still been in her job right up until the other end, but she was overrunning the Department of Energy, I dare say we would have. No, in all seriousness, yes. Yes. And do you mean specifically in connection
About
with the
the
election?
2016, yeah.
Oh, I mean, people ask me this all the time, too, and the answer to that is, the question is, has the U.S. government done enough, either the previous administration or this administration? No. And proof, look at Vladimir Putin. The man is the proof. Does this guy look like he's learned any lessons from this? So the question to answer, you don't need to ask an American that question. You just look at Vladimir Putin. Does it look like he has learned his lessons from Obama or Trump about this? No, of course not. And so we haven't done enough. But again, you don't accumulate that kind of leverage in a narrow channel.
Right.
That's a mistake. That's why you have to have a broader strategy.
Right. Let's throw it open since we're short on time. Yes.
I'm Lenore Martin. I'm at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And you alluded to Syria, and I wonder if you could give us an assessment of how, how the United States sees the danger, how you, when you were in the Defense Department, what kind of a danger you see of the Soviet, I'm sorry, you can tell where I am, of the Russian position in Syria, and really how we can respond to it.
It's a Soviet position in Syria, actually.
Thank you.
The short answer. Well, first of all, let's go back to the Russian blundering into Syria in the first place, and just tell the story of that, and then we'll wind up to the future. The Russians came in, if you'll remember, saying that they were going to fight ISIS and move Assad aside. That is, promote a political transition. They didn't do either of those things. They lied and didn't do what they said they were going to do. They lied to me personally, by the way. So first of all, they didn't have any role in any constructive role at all in the defeat of ISIS, which is now almost complete in Iraq and Syria. The United States did that, and it's by the way, NATO allies. A whole other issue about whether Quad NATO participated. Became a victim of theology, but the NATO countries did, and very ably. No other country could have done that but us. And we did it with our Syrian and Iraqi allies and friends, by the way, who get the first credit. The Russians didn't have anything to do with that. And they haven't moved Assad aside. They've turbocharged him and thereby prolonged the Syrian civil war. So that's what they said they were going to do, and that's what they did. That was evident to me immediately, which is why I opposed any efforts to get us associated. They were desperate to associate the United States with this misadventure and tried to bait the United States into various kinds of associations with it. President Obama did a sensible thing, which is conditioned any kind of such association on them doing what they were supposed to be doing. And of course, they never met those conditions, and so he handled it. Very well. But I adamantly opposed that because you could see the trick right in front. They wanted us to be morally and politically complicit in their misadventure. Today, now with the defeat of ISIL and their destruction in Mosul and Raqqa, and therefore essentially the destruction of the idea as well as the fact that there can be an Islamic State based upon barbarism of this sort. And the attention with respect to that, I think, needs to turn to the political and economic aftermath. I've been concerned for a long time, and I was saying this a year ago, by which time I was confident that we knew exactly how we were going to do this, and I could more or less see the timetable, though I never spoke about the timetable, because when I talk about timetables in war is a dangerous thing to do. I always talked about the military campaign is going to outrun the political and economic campaign, and that's my principal concern at this juncture. Part of that is the fate of Syria and the Russian adventure in Syria. They show no signs of having learned any particular lessons in that regard. I think we are in a much stronger position. Having won the war, having our people having won the war, our people being, he wouldn't like it said this way, and so I don't mean it this way, but those like Prime Minister Abadi in Baghdad, who bet upon the United States and also bet upon multi-sectarianism for Iraq, have won in the eyes of their own people. And there's nothing like winning to validate leadership. And so, yes, there's Iranian influence in Baghdad, and yes, there are Russians screwing around down in the Dar Azur type area down the lower Euphrates Valley. But we're in a much stronger position because we're the winners against ISIS. And the Russians are still mired in the Syrian civil war. So that's the story there. It's not over. It's not done. And the Russians are, I think, blundering about. And it's another area where we need to stand strong, and you can't be associated with it.
Question in this second row here. All right, here comes the mic. Yeah.
Thanks. Jed Schwartz from Somerville. It would seem that members of a extra-national group interfering, lobbying or campaigning in the electoral affairs of a different country is okay if it's legal, that is, if it's above board. That being the case, how do you interpret Citizens versus United, the Citizens versus United case. I mean, how doesn't that case make it very difficult to distinguish between, say, the funds of Americans and the funds of Russians, to be blunt? I mean, if you can't, if those, the sources, the ownership of the funds coming into the campaign are not in the public sphere, are protected, then how is it possible for anyone to distinguish Russian financial influences upon the campaign?
Well, I mean, look, two wrongs don't make a right. So I'm a big lover of the way we do campaign funding.
You say you're not.
I'm not a big lover.
Oh, yeah,
no,
that was
no,
the point I
no.
was trying to.
So I'm not happy with Americans buying disproportionate influence, but at least they're not Russian. So one doesn't excuse the other, and this is the Russian government manipulating the American people. Now, our government has a responsibility to protect our people, and it didn't discharge that responsibility in this case, and it needs to. That's what that was not the Defense Department, but that's what law enforcement and intelligence and Homeland Security are supposed to do. And this is an unwelcome and untoward intrusion upon our country by a foreign country. And that's one of the reasons you pay your taxes, is that so your government stops that kind of thing.
Can we get the mic over to our director?
Thank you, Joe. You haven't mentioned Europe in the last half an hour, and I wonder.
I haven't mentioned Europe.
Well,
That's an odd thing to say. I have several times.
well, I mean, you talk about Eastern Flank and so on, but you didn't mention Europe as a political actor. Is this game only U.S.-Russia game, or we have some other actors on whom we can count, whom we can encourage to do certain things, whom we should disregard? What's the thinking about that part of the
I
story?
think you're going to be happy with what I say, which is that we shouldn't disregard Europeans, and I apologize if I gave any such impression. I don't, and I'm a huge friend of NATO. I think NATO and I think the attacks on NATO, which I hope have been now sort of a kind of passing storm, but you can never tell, were unwarranted. And Europe, I frequently say to people, if you're an American, I say to my fellow Americans, take a globe, spin the globe, and say, where on earth do you find people that share much of what you think is valuable in life and worth defending in the first place? And Europe's not the only place, but the finger will go to Europe. And I realize that makes invidious comparisons with other parts of the world, but that's the way it is. The way they conduct themselves, the way they govern themselves, and principles that we are mutually wedded to. I also believe that Europe is immensely powerful. Do I wish they spent more on defense? Yes, and I join a long string of American defense leaders who have largely fruitlessly banged our spoon on our high chair about the need for more money to be spent by Europeans on their own defense, and I regret that. Still and all, every time we have asked Europe to join us in a serious defense of civilization, and every time they have asked us, we both ponied up, whether it be immediate aftermath of 9/11, Afghanistan, Bosnia, Kosovo, and the performance has been terrific. I see a few of you here who know this perfectly well, but when it comes to Syria, Iraq, Northern Africa, South Saharan Africa, wherever you go around the world, the performance of NATO forces working with U.S. forces has been exceptional in their military capabilities and in the way they conducted themselves.
Demetrius?
Thank you very much for this very insightful, all these insightful comments, but I'm a little confused because by listening to you referring to Syria and Iraq, one would get the impression that we are dealing with a great success on the part of the US foreign and defense policy, and one might dispute that.
So one is you, so why don't you go ahead?
Right. Well, I'm not necessarily endorsing the dispute, but I'm just conveying. So in Iraq, one might say that it is Iran that is calling the shot and not the United States. And we've seen that with Kirkuk recently. So I want to comment there. I also want to comment on the Kurdish issue and the recent developments there on the part of the US. And finally, as I am Greek and coming from Greece, a comment on the rapid deterioration in US-Turkish relations. And Turkey is a member of NATO, can create problems in NATO where decisions are consensus-based, as the second largest land army in NATO. And so how do you see things in this very difficult triangle of Turkey, Middle East, Kurds, and the rest? Thank you.
Very, very good questions. And to the point about Iran, you're right that Iraq remains in play as between Iranian influence and other influence, including the U.S. influence. And the victory against ISIS does not put that to rest. You're absolutely right. It does, however, much advantage the United States, not Iran, and Abadi, not the Maliki types in Baghdad. So it doesn't dispose of the matter, but it strengthens our hand. But one would be foolish not to recognize that Baghdad, southeastern Syria are places that are in play. And I certainly acknowledge that. But we've got to get in the game to protect our own friends and protect our own interests. So that is far from over. The Kirkuk thing I have a very close interpretation of, because I dealt with Prime Minister Abadi and President Barzani constantly over a couple of years. And it's an inherently tense relationship, we all know. And starting 2 years ago, or a little over 2 years ago, when I put together the plan for the taking of Mosul, and of course this is like we were nowhere. Ramadi had fallen. The Iraqi security forces were in disarray. They had basically walked out of Ramadi. So it was going to be a long slog, and I knew that of rebuilding the Iraqi armed forces, which we eventually did, and built the brigades that would then slowly work their way up the Tigris River Valley and from Ramadi to Rutbah, Fallujah, and so forth up into Makhmur and Kiara, and eventually the envelopment of Mosul and the taking of Mosul. It was necessary, part of our plan, that from the north, the Peshmerga, the KRG Peshmerga, also participate, and that the two forces be able to work together. There was a period in the campaign, for example, when the Iraqi security forces, which were wheeling left, eastward and northward of Mosul, were passing through the Peshmerga lines down towards ISIL. I went in last October, I don't know when, to a Kurdish air base, and there were Iraqi aircraft operating out of that Kurdish. I mean, imagine that. Now that was based upon month after month after month of constant conversation with those two people. And they said, how can we trust one another? And I said, I don't expect you to trust one another, but trust me. And I'll make sure everybody sticks to the rules. This is the plan. You don't get to keep what you take. That's kind of the deal. And otherwise, I'll cut you off. And that worked. That worked. I don't know how. It was always going to be dodgy at the end, because Mosul's a complicated place, by the way. It's not just Kurds and the Iraqi security forces there. It's got Yazidis and Turkmen and Christians, and it's a complicated place. Unusual sectarian mix. It was going to be and is a complicated thing. But they stuck together, and it came a little bit unglued in association with what I thought was an ill-advised calling for a referendum by Barzani. I didn't think that was a wise thing to do. It had the predictable consequences. And now I think our folks, I certainly hope they are, my successors are trying to get this back in the box and get everybody to calm down. But that's the Iranian, you made it an Iranian thing. It's really not. It's an Erbil versus Baghdad thing. And that's all very understandable. The Iranian, the militias, remember the militias, the Shia militias come in two flavors. There are those that fall underneath a body and his command and control and are paid by them, which we don't love, but that's, he did successfully assert control over them, and they operate in accordance with his plans and in a non-sectarian manner. They don't do a whole lot, but that's okay too. The Iranian associated militias had no role whatsoever in defeating ISIS. They ride around behind the lines, flying their flags and giving press conferences. And so they're basically useless. And so I think they create a larger image than is warranted of them, Hadi al-Amri and those guys. And so, and I think that they were not part of a victory, and therefore the victory, in fact, sidelines them, rather than if they had delivered the victory to the Iraqi people, that would be a serious problem.
No, sorry, Ash, we had promised to get you out of here 5 minutes ago, but thank you very
Thank you
much
all
for
very much.
taking your time.
Turkey is a whole other question. Thanks very much. Joe. Appreciate it.
That's great. Thanks. So we'll now have part two of the afternoon session, and we're joined, as Ash pointed out, by two people who are smarter than I am, but at least I have them flanking me. So
I was
can
going to say the flanking was different on this.
In any case, on my left is Karen Domfried, who is president of the German Marshall Foundation, and on my right is Elizabeth Sherwood Randall, who most recently was Deputy Secretary of Energy. But what these two remarkable women have in common, among a variety of things, is that both of them were the key person on Europe on the National Security Council. Not at the same time, but if you want to know who was running policy on Europe, you would have to know the words Elizabeth Sherwood and Karen Domfried. I mean, that Karen was also the National Intelligence Officer for Europe, so she has long experience in addition to the NSC experience. And Liz, as Ash mentioned, has long experience in a variety of places, but in particular in the Defense Department. And if you want to have a tribute to Liz Sherwood Randall, pick up Bill Perry's memoirs, the former Secretary of Defense, and you will find her properly praised in many places in many ways. So we're lucky to have two such able people with such relevant experience. And we were going to have them each make a presentation, but they decided at lunch that they would rather have a conversation and that we ought to hold it around the big issue, which we already raised as a group at lunch with Anna Palacio, but which has been a central issue for this conference, which is what's going on with populism in our democracies. Do our democracies still work? Will they continue to work? And what does that mean for a rules-based international system? We've seen in the United States a president who, for the first time in 70 years, has challenged that international rules-based framework, which was set up after 1945. We've seen Britain remove itself or begin the process of removing itself from Europe. And we've seen a set of electoral results in both Eastern Europe and in Turkey, in which you have what you might call authoritarian democracy, if that's not an oxymoron, but a case where you have an elected leader, but the liberalism is drained out of the system. And so you have a major set of changes going on, and some people would say that it's going to continue. And if you look at the German election turned out all right, but the AfD did better than expected. The Austrian situation is a bit questionable. French turned out all right, but we don't know how long. So there's a set of anxieties or concerns that cut across a whole series of issues that are central to this conference. And I wonder if I could ask each of you to tell us how the world looks from your point of view around those issues. Anna started us on this, but there's still a lot to be led. So, Karen, let me turn to you first, since you were next on the agenda, and then Liz, I'll turn to you next.
Well, first, it's great to be here, and it's wonderful to have Jonai chairing this session. And I think you put a lot of really difficult issues on the table. And in a sense, the fundamental question is what happens when liberal democracies produce illiberal results. And I think we're trying to deal with that question in the transatlantic community. And it's certainly fundamental to the question about what Europe's future is and what the future of the transatlantic relationship is. And when I think about the future of Europe, I do think the role of the United States is critical in this. And it sometimes does help to understand the present when you look at the past. And this Europe that we're talking about, I would argue, would not exist were it not for the policy that the United States pursued at the end of World War II. The U.S. used the tremendous power it had at that moment to create a web of multilateral institutions, but also to encourage European integration. I mean, I run an organization called the German Marshall Fund of the U.S. It was built out of a generous gift from West Germany, thanking us Americans for the Marshall Plan, not only for helping to rebuild Europe's economies, but for having included the former enemy in that group of countries. And if you look at the way that the European Recovery Plan Authorization Act was amended in 1949, it was expressly to show U.S. support for the integration of Europe. So, we think about that past and that period of history, which I would argue is a stellar example of enlightened American leadership. And this is by no means a partisan comment. Remember, in that period, you had a Democratic president and Republican isolationist majorities in the U.S. Congress. Yet a bridge was built. Arthur Vandenberg, the Republican senator who chaired the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, was on that bandwagon with Secretary Marshall and others, making the case across this country that it was in our national interest to spend 12% of our national budget on helping to rebuild Europe. Now, you look then at the ensuing 70 years, and it's not that transatlantic relations were always harmonious. There were lots of very serious disagreements, whether we think back to the Suez Crisis, a U.S. president preventing essentially Britain and France from pursuing military action. You remember the Euro missile crisis in the 80s, NATO's double-track decision, and the fact that a West German government of Helmut Schmidt fell because the left wing of the Social Democratic Party did not want the U.S. deploying intermediate nuclear forces in West Germany. And we know how that story ended. Or the Iraq War, where President Bush was not on speaking terms with French President Chirac or German Chancellor Schröder because they opposed that military action. So it's not that we've always agreed, but that underlying belief in this international order that we built together after World War II remained, and we always found the way back. And I think what's so concerning to many Europeans today is the question about whether this is a policy difference that they're facing with the U.S. administration of President Trump, or whether it's something more fundamental. And has the U.S. turned away from this belief in this order based on a belief in democracy, free market economies, rule of law, rights of the individual, and instead believes that a closed society better serves U.S. interests, nationalism, protectionism. And this is so different from the challenges we thought we were facing. We thought the challenge to the order was a rising China or an aggressive Russia. And in fact, part of the challenge is coming from within our own societies, whether that's here in the U.S. or whether it's the rise of populism and nationalism across Europe. And so the challenge for us is, if we think open societies and that liberal order remain in the U.S. interests and do capture the values and principles that we believe in, we actually have to stand up and defend it. And we can't take it for granted anymore. And I think that's something really important for us to remember and for our European allies to remember.
Karen, before I turn to Liz, let me press you a little bit with a couple of questions. If you look at the recent polls taken by the Chicago Council on Foreign Relations, they show that 62 or 3% of Americans still hold internationalist attitudes. What's more, you get majorities in favor of trade, despite the conventional wisdom that we've gone fully protectionist. NATO has support of the great majority of Americans. So how much is it, without getting into partisanship, but just as thinking historically in an analytical sense, how much is it that America is turning away from this 70-year history? And how much is it that we had a strange blip historically in 2016, which the candidate who held views that were different was elected, and that if 300,000 people had voted differently in 3 states, we wouldn't be having this conversation, or would we be having this conversation?
I don't think it's a partisan discussion because I actually don't think this is a partisan issue. And, that would open up a whole debate about whether Donald Trump is actually a Republican. But the issues you highlighted, trade and NATO, are issues that establishment Republicans have been very strong on. I mean, it's actually the Democratic Party that has raised concerns about free trade agreements and whether they appropriately protect environment and uphold labor standards. So it's actually it's beyond partisanship, I think, and you can question whether this is an aberration, but I don't think we don't know the answer to the question of whether a post-Trump America looks like a pre-Trump America, because damage is being done to these institutions. There's no question in my mind about that. And it seems to me that we do need to rebuild a consensus in this country about majority support, not maybe in the population, but in the governing class in support of a free trade agreement. I mean, the fact that President Trump chose not to pursue the Trans-Pacific Partnership sent a message to Europeans that there was no hope that the Transatlantic Trade and Economic Partnership, Trade and Investment Partnership was going to be pursued by this administration. We now have a NAFTA that will be either renegotiated or scrapped, which has enormous implications not only for Canada and Mexico, but for our European allies, because of the inordinate amount of European investment in this country that depends on that single supply chain across these three North American countries. So the implications of what happens now, I think, do matter. I don't think you can make the case that America as a country has moved away from supporting this order. But because we are the dominant power in the system, how we conduct ourselves and the choices we make will carry implications beyond these 4 years.
As I mentioned, I was in Ottawa over the weekend at a meeting with a group of Mexicans and Canadians talking about NAFTA that you've just mentioned. And one of the Mexicans there, a very distinguished person who had been a minister in the government and had actually been a negotiator of the NAFTA treaty, said the great sadness that he had about this was not just the money that was being lost in terms of trade that would be disrupted, but that the Mexicans had seen this as a reorientation and modernization of Mexican foreign policy, getting away from the fixation on anti-Americanism. He said what strikes him as devastating is to see the re-emergence of anti-Americanism in Mexico. Do you see anything like this happening in Europe or in Germany in particular, but in Europe, which is a sense of, these Americans aren't what we thought they were?
Absolutely. If you look at favorability ratings of President Trump in a country like Germany, he's about 9%. And that is quite similar across Western Europe. There is an important division within Europe. And I think it's not surprising that President Trump made a visit to Poland. And it was in Poland that he reaffirmed U.S. commitment to Article 5 of the NATO treaty. You'll all remember that during the campaign, President Trump had talked about NATO being obsolete, and at the NATO leaders meeting in Brussels, he had not reaffirmed that U.S. commitment. So there was this pent-up demand to hear the U.S. president say those words, which he did. But we also know that he's continuing to beat the drum very hard on our European allies spending 2% of their GDP on defense. And we just heard Ash Carter say he carried that message to our European allies. It's not a new message. It's a rather longstanding message on the part of American presidents and American secretaries of defense. But because President Trump is so unpopular, it's actually making it harder for many of our European allies to meet that commitment, because, and you'll see this in Germany, now that you have the Social Democrats who had been part of the Grand Coalition government together with Angela Merkel's CDU and her sister party CSU, now that the Social Democrats will be in the opposition, they are already saying this idea of spending 2% of our GDP on defense doesn't make sense. And they're campaigning against a position that they had supported and agreed to when they were in government. So the politics of the moment absolutely is influencing the policies of the moment.
Can I just add, I'll jump ahead just to say, I think it is unbelievably damaging to transatlantic relations that America cannot be counted on. When we form alliances, we make commitments that provide predictability and certainty in an uncertain and threatening world. And what has happened has moved our allies to state clearly, we can't be counted on. Angela Merkel said this in May. It was so striking when she came out and basically said, Europe needs to take care of itself. We can't look to the United States anymore. That is a staggering change, and one with enormous implications for our role in the world and the advancement of both our interests and our values.
And I think that there had been a view that alliances are something enduring. And now what President Trump has brought to this equation is a view that alliances are actually transactional. And it's, what have you done for me lately? And depending on that, that will determine how I respond to you. So that's a fundamental shift. And it actually connects to something you said, Joe, which is about where is the United States as a whole. You also increasingly see subnational actors in the United States standing up saying, actually, we don't agree with the position that President Trump articulated, say, on withdrawing from the Paris Climate Agreement. We, as California, we, as this coalition of Northeast liberal states, are going to continue to adhere to the Paris agreements. And if we all listened to NPR this morning, we heard Governor Brown is on his way to Bonn, Germany, for the UN Climate Conference. So it's interesting because it is adding another layer to the transatlantic relationship that has never been built out in that way, of European national leaders looking to do business with American subnational actors at the state and city level.
Let me just add a footnote on that, Karen, then I want to turn to Liz to give us his perspective on the larger question. But if you look at American soft power, what you find is there have been times in the past when we've lost it. And Vietnam was a good example. When people were marching in the streets to oppose the U.S. government, we were pretty unpopular around the world. And yet the interesting thing is that the marchers didn't sing the Internationale that Ho Chi Minh would have preferred. They sang Martin Luther King's We Shall Overcome. And so the argument that some people make is that American civil society creates soft power, not the American government, and that the types of things you just mentioned will preserve the U.S.-European relationship because of the interconnection of the civil societies. But if you take that comment that I mentioned by my Mexican friend, he would say, yes, but. In other words, you're beginning to lose some of that because for a populist politician like Lopez Obrador, who is a candidate for president of the Moreno Party in Mexico, anti-Americanism is a great platform. Mm-hmm. And so, I don't know, we may come through this all right, we may not, but do you detect a populism, for example, in Germany, but could be elsewhere, in which politicians, most people are in one direction, but politicians are like, here's a good platform.
Mm-hmm. Well, two comments to that. I think that Europeans absolutely are looking at American civil society. And I have so many European friends, colleagues who say, we really see this as a stress test for American democracy. And we're watching how your media is responding, how your court system is responding, what Congress is doing. So I actually think it's encouraging people to look more broadly at what are the constituent parts of the U.S. democracy. And of course, the president is a critical figure. I mean, there's no one who has a larger bully pulpit in the world than the U.S. president. But there is a much greater diversity of our democracy that I think is getting notice. And to your second point about, is this providing a platform for populists in Europe? Interestingly, I think some of what we've seen this year in Europe has been a reaction against Brexit and Trump. And I think there was a concern in the Dutch election earlier this year in March that the far-right party there, the Party Fiat Wilders, would end up being the largest party in the Netherlands. Now, he did better, but they didn't end up being the number one party, and people thought, that may have been a reaction against the tumult that Brexit and Trump have set off. Then you had the French election, and Marine Le Pen did very well. I mean, receiving over more than a third of the vote, much better than her father had done. But as we all know, Macron won. And then in the German election, we saw for the first time a far-right party come into the German parliament, not just cross that 5% threshold, but be the third largest party in parliament. So you see these populist forces going up and down. I mean, since then we've seen an election in Austria and an election in the Czech Republic that would come down more on the populist side of the ledger. So I think you're seeing reactions across these countries and across the Atlantic. And the verdict is not out. I mean, there is an opportunity for Macron and Merkel to, as Juncker said, put wind in the sails of the EU. But there's also much to suggest that these winds of populism that are challenging the American system are going to lead the European Union to be able to maybe not do much more than the lowest common denominator. I think we don't know the answer to that.
Liz, let me turn to you for your reaction to the basic question. You and I were together at a meeting in Aspen this summer, which looked at the future of a rules-based international system. And what's your prognosis?
So thank you, Joe. What you didn't note in the introduction was that you trained me. And so I am always awed and humbled to be in your presence. And I have chosen we had a discussion this morning about whether academics should take the risk of putting themselves in the arena, what the responsibilities were of academics to do that, and what would the consequences be for their careers should they do it. I made that perilous choice, realizing I could never be Joe Nye. I chose to try to spend my life translating ideas into action, and here I am today. I'll make 3 points in honor of Stanley Hoffman, founder of the Center for European Studies. First of all, I think, and he would have said this, history matters. Anna said this earlier in a different context, but I do think as we look at the history of the Atlantic Alliance, and Karen has illuminated some of this, we have to be cognizant that the glue of the alliance that held it together for so long at times of great stress on the alliance is no longer the same as it was. Now, Ash Carter described a resurgent Russia and the threats that it presents, but we don't have the sensation, at least not yet, of a complete return to a Cold War standoff between the United States and the Soviet Union. That's what kept us together, and when we looked at the impact on American leadership when we had a Vietnam, for example, or a number of other crises in the history of the alliance, ultimately the alliance hung together. I think we're in a different time now. And so the first thing we need to do is look at the threats we face and assess whether those threats motivate us to stand together or fall apart. And that would lead me to my second point, which is that and this was something President Obama said from the very start, we are stronger when we stand together as liberal democracies. So if we look at the challenges we're facing, we talked about some of them this morning, economies that have faced extreme stress over the last 8-9 years, rising income disparity in many of our countries, perception that the game is rigged, perpetual underclasses facing a lack of opportunity, though that was challenged by some of our speakers this morning, a future of work in question in all of our economies. What does work look like in an increasingly automated, digitized, technologically advanced age? Refugee flows challenging our humanity, terrorists threatening our way of life, and nation states building arsenals that could obliterate the planet. So if you stack those up, you'd say, well, yes, there are exigent threats like the Soviet threat. They don't manifest in the same monolithic way, but we have every reason to stand together, and the fact is that we can't solve any of these problems on our own. So I come to this with the keen sense that despite the many cleavages right now in our own country, in European countries, and between us, that we have to find a way forward together. And that leads me to my third point, which is a conclusion of my observation of the practice of international statecraft over the last 8 years, and more than that, which is that the world does not self-organize. And as Richard Haas has written in his recent book on the world in disarray, American leadership is indispensable. And so if we lead poorly, the world is not actually going to move in a direction that advances the shared interests of liberal democracies. So we, as I said in point 2, we need each other, but also we need to lead. And when I look at the agenda that we pursued with our European allies from the very start in the Obama administration, where the principle that we set forth was everything we do in the world, we need to do in conjunction with our allies, whether it's addressing climate change, addressing the Iranian nuclear threat, addressing the implications of the Arab Spring. We have to do it together, and we need to go through NATO and through the national capitals in Europe in order to achieve our goals. What we are seeing right now is asynchronous, obviously. We have a situation in which the view is that we can go it alone, and you'll either, as Bush once said, be with us or against us, but that doesn't appear to be the outcome. And so my great concern now is that we find ourselves facing that list of threats, and we could list many more, and that we will not hang together in the face of them, and that America won't lead in response to them. And I'll just close by saying that, Joe, many, many years ago, you wrote a prescient book about power and interdependence, in which you described a world that was increasingly interdependent. And if that was the case several decades ago when you wrote it, it's even more so today on so many of these global threats that we face. And so it's imperative upon all of us to stand up and to animate that civil society that you mentioned, Karen, where our European allies see us as having a vibrant civil society. But for those of us who are Americans, we need to participate in it, as do our friends in Europe, and ensure that as we go forward, our democracies are strengthened and not destroyed.
Let me press you a few points, Liz, before we throw it open to the audience. I agree with you, obviously, about the importance of American leadership, but suppose it doesn't occur in the next 3 years. Then what? Are the Europeans capable of preserving a rules-based international system without, I mean, imagine we should have American leadership. Let's assume, as a hypothesis, that we don't have it, or we won't have it for 3 years. Can the Europeans step into the breach and try to preserve a rules-based system? They talk all the time about a rules-based system. Can they do anything about it?
It's hard for me to imagine an effective global pursuit of the issues that we face today without America in the game in a constructive role. And whether that is about the advancement of democracy, where we have been the beacon on the hill, showing what it means to function as a multi-ethnic democracy and a federal democracy as well, back to Anna's conversation, to the economic challenges that we all face, some of which I enumerated, to the military threats that exist. Absent American leadership, and given the track record of Europe, and some of what we heard this morning in the dialogue, which I thought was emblematic of what I observed in my time in the administration between our German and our Greek colleagues, it's hard to see Europe standing alone and together to make sufficient progress in the face of the threats that exist today to our countries.
If you think about the post-45 order, there were several strands to it. We often lump them together and call it the liberal international order. But there was a security strand of alliances. There was a strand of economic institutions, the Bretton Woods institutions. there is another strand relating to human rights and democracy. The security strand seems to have done a little bit better than we feared. NATO, after having been obsolete a year ago, became not obsolete by April of this year, which is really quite a remarkable turnaround in such a short time. Doug Lute has left,
That's
but
right.
I give Doug a lot of credit for such a short turnaround.
And we modernized our nuclear arsenal in 6 months, too.
That's right. But anyway, the point is that on the security side, the threat to the order wasn't quite as bad in practice. But on the trade side, we haven't begun to see the full.
It's catastrophic.
And TTIP is gone. TPP is gone. TTIP is basically
storage.
gone. They're in storage, and the WTO system may be broken by the fact that we're not appointing new judges and so forth, and the way we're treating the NAFTA renegotiations, in which our bargaining position is take it or leave it. That's called bargaining. And that could have catastrophic effects on trade. And when it comes to human rights, what I haven't heard much complaint about Orban or much
Or
complaint
Erdogan.
about Erdogan.
Or Putin.
So and this goes back to Dimitri's question, which didn't have time, Ash
Yeah.
didn't have time to answer. What do we do about situations like Erdogan or like Orban?
Well, you lumped a lot in that, so, okay, I think that I
It's
left.
not fair, but
You left with the last answer, I feel that I was pessimistic. So I'll begin with Havel, who said, hope is a state of spirit. So we obviously have to have hope that we can find our way through this. It is damaging to our interests to have pulled out of these trade agreements because our competitors will get the edge on us, and that's particularly true in Asia, where we have seen immediately a redirection of attention to China. That is, if we're not going to do this big Trans-Pacific Agreement, then countries want to cut deals with China because they know that's a very large market. And that's it's not in our national economic interest nor the shared economic interests that we have with our European allies and partners. We need to set an example of how we manage a crisis like the one that we face and the countries in Europe face. And it does require disciplined leadership. And we've discussed the fact that we have states and mayors, cities acting to try to mobilize public opinion and to engage internationally, which frankly previously I would have thought was insubordinate behavior by a state or a locality. But now I think it may be that signal we need to send to the world that not all Americans are in agreement with the decision of the United States to withdraw from its international leadership role on such important issues as the survival of our planet. And so I think we do need, as I said previously, to act. Now, when it comes to Turkey, Joe, I mean, do you want?
Yes,
we
no,
can,
no,
we
no.
can, this is a subject that
Dimitri
I've worked
demands
on
an
with the
answer.
Center for European Studies for quite a while. Karen also had responsibility for the challenging relationship with Turkey. It has had its ebbs and flows, of course. I think we're at a very low point at the moment, and it really does reflect a deteriorating domestic situation in Turkey that is very alarming. As a NATO ally, we have a country that has moved as close to authoritarianism as it can be under what these terms, what Fareed calls illiberal democracy, right? Elected, but employing terms that are suspicious, we can say. So I began the administration with President Obama when the relationship with Turkey was at a very low point, given the legacy of the invasion of Iraq. We made a commitment to rebuilding and repairing and strengthening that relationship, and President Obama invested a lot of time and energy in that relationship. And we faced a lot of challenging issues in the region. Iran was probably the principal concern at the outset of the administration, where we had significant tensions with Turkey. But we were able, through an investment in the relationship, to work a number of those issues through to advance our policy goals. That has not been sustainable. And I think the reality is we're really at a potential breaking point with Turkey, where NATO is asking the question, what is the value of Turkey in the alliance? And the Turks are asking the question, what is the value of being in NATO? And that, after more than a half century of being allies with the largest Muslim country that had been a democracy in NATO, is of enormous implication for our future. And if I were still in government, I would argue actually against what was said this morning by one of our panelists who thought that we should cut off all exchanges and not send academics to countries that have moved to, we were discussing Hungary and Turkey, for example. We shouldn't have lots of contact. We should isolate them. I actually am of the opposite view, that in a circumstance in which you see a country that you worry is going in the wrong direction, you should flood the zone. You should get in there, you should be present, you should be up in their faces, you should do everything you can to use every dimension of the relationship, academic, cultural, political, economic, and military, to pull them back from the brink. And frankly, that's what we need to do among ourselves with the other countries that are at risk, because to isolate them only allows their leaders then to cut the country off from the kinds of influences that would pull them back from the brink.
One last question before we throw it open to the audience, and that's about China. The Europeans talk about a rules-based system, and yet China flouts the law of the sea tribunal decision that claimed that you cannot pour sand on an atoll and call it an island. And the Europeans haven't really done much about that. But if they're serious about global rules, shouldn't they do more? In the meantime, China has turned Piraeus into a wholly owned subsidiary of Chinese OBOR, the One Belt, One Road. So the Chinese essentially prevent Europe from taking common positions which may be awkward to China by buying off various European countries so that Brussels can't do much. And in the meantime, they promote One Belt, One Road and buy facilities which give them leverage. And in the meantime, the Europeans talk about a rules-based system and don't do anything about it. What should the Europeans do about China?
I couldn't have said it better, Joe. And I think when in the first term of the Obama administration, we saw that it was actually quite difficult to get our European allies to pay much attention to Asia. They're very consumed with the Eurozone crisis, of course, and very internally focused. And we were left to manage the dynamic with China, Japan, Korea, North Korea, et cetera, with the exception of trade missions. And I think in particular, Angela Merkel was quite shrewd and identified China as a very important market and was engaged, but really principally on economic issues, not on security issues, not on issues of democratic practice or rules, the norms of a rules-based international order. It has only become exacerbated in the last 5 years. And what we see, what I saw in my last years in the administration was a very, very deliberate effort on the part of the Chinese to secure through their economic policy, if possible, that is overtly to secure opportunity, as you described it, the One Belt, One Road policy, but also through less overt means, if necessary, the advantage technologically and militarily that would position them to be dominant in the world. And we are not, as a collective, that is the United States and Europe, organized to meet that. We haven't actually faced a challenge like China in the West. And Ash has spoken about this. So I'll give credit to Ash on this thought, which is that the Soviet threat was a very different one. It was a closed economy. It wasn't an economic rival to us in any way. In fact, it was the guns versus butter trade-off, all focused on the military strength and very weak economy. The Chinese are a very growing and powerful economy and present us with challenges that we don't actually have yet a toolkit to meet. We don't know how to match that. So, for example, I have a son at Stanford. He's a junior. He's an engineer. He's being recruited actively to join Chinese companies, which are looking to suck up the best and brightest of our talent and outcompete us. That's a deliberate strategy, supported by the government. Scientists are being set up in big labs in China to beat us in CRISPR-Cas9 and gene editing technology or in any supercomputing, you name it, whatever's on the cutting edge, they're trying to get ahead of the edge. So we actually need together, the United States and Europe, to have a strategy to match that and to meet the challenge and to find ourselves on the other side of this period of such turbulence in a leading position rather than behind.
Karen, do you want to say anything about China before we
Sure.
throw it open?
You know, what it makes me think about is, you know, your comment that, well, maybe the American public writ large isn't behind some of these America First policies. But as we know, vacuums don't remain vacuums, they're filled. So when the U.S. today is making decisions to step back from leading globally, TPP is a really good example of that when we're talking about an economic relationship with Asia. And we saw the EU then immediately conclude its trade agreement with Japan. I'm not sure that would have happened so neatly had TPP gone forward. So you see the Europeans realizing they want to try to help fill that vacuum, but they can't make up for the weight of the U.S. in the global system. So our absence there does matter. Your example of Greece with the port of Piraeus is another really important one of how anytime there's an opening, the Chinese are ready to fill it. Every UN position that we are vacating, the Chinese are putting people up to fill them. So I think that facts are being created because of the role the U.S. is choosing not to play in the world right now. And, you know, where this leads us, I actually think there might be an opportunity here in the U.S.-European relationship because I think many, if not most, European leaders do believe that there isn't a West they can imagine that the U.S. is not playing a leadership role in. So whether it's Macron inviting President Trump to Bastille Day to mark the 100th anniversary of the U.S. entry into World War I, whether it's Angela Merkel after her Oval Office visit inviting Ivanka Trump to Berlin in advance of a G7 meeting, they're trying to figure out how to build a relationship with the U.S. And I do think that President Trump worries about China. And there may well be some discrete projects on China where you could have transatlantic cooperation, whether it's around how do you protect intellectual property. And so it seems to me that this is an area where we should try to be creating some constructive ideas where Americans and Europeans can work together to stand up for the values and principles that we believe in.
Well, just to pick up on that, Karen, I think we heard this morning from our social science center in Berlin that there is significant continuing federal support in Germany for research and development, even if in the United States it's being cut way back. So I would say here's an example of something we could do. We could do more collaborative work, research and development in the most important scientific domains in which if we are able to advance, even if the United States funding is declining, we will sustain that edge. I mean, it would be to look for ways that we can build outside of government more potential collaboration with our German partners and with others in Europe who are willing to make those investments. We've heard Macron say to American scientists when the US budget proposal came out and there was a slashing of the science and technology research budget proposed by President Trump, Macron said, we invite all of your scientists to come to France and do your work in France, which made people laugh as you're laughing. But also, I thought he's so shrewd, and what we should be doing, of course, is doing it collaboratively.
Well, let's throw it open. Questions from the audience? They're back, halfway back.
I guess I have a very different perspective than the perspective
Can you
all-
introduce yourself?
Yes,
so we know who you are?
Richard Rosen. I work on economics of climate change, but my question is broader. In listening to you, as I've listened to many talks from the Washington sort of think
Swamp.
tanks about, U.S. Strategic interests, U.S. values, all this, you act like we all agree. We don't agree at all. I hope there are many people in this room that completely object to current U.S. actions, particularly, our military aggressiveness, starting after World War II with the Korean War, the Vietnam War, et cetera. A lot of us were in the anti-Vietnam War movement. A lot of us support peace, not war. I see you all still talking about making the U.S. and NATO an aggressive military operation. A lot of us think that war in the Middle East wouldn't have been nearly so possible if we hadn't shipped weapons to people on both sides. If you don't manufacture weapons, if you cut back your military industrial complex, people can't shoot at each other if they don't have guns. So there are a lot of assumptions that you're making about consensus in the U.S., even among, quote, liberal democratic thinkers, that are just wrong.
So I'll say I don't make any assumptions.
No,
what I'll
you
say is that
do.
if you posit that our disarmament would have led others to disarm, there is literally no evidence of that.
Well, I don't
And so
think
I don't-
there's a
what
lot
is-
of evidence, though, that American aggressiveness over the last 50 years has caused a lot of terrorism and war. Okay, I don't think we should have 174 military bases, maybe 4. There's huge disagreements between people, I hope in this room, that would be for the peace movement or for a new peace movement that was strong like it used to be, and the rest of you, because there's no consensus about what U.S. strategic interests are. There's no consensus about American values. You tell me what values you support. I support peace. I support economic development in China. Just a second, please. You objected to the fact that your son was being solicited by organizations in China. The U.S. has done that for decades. So if we can solicit the best talent here, why shouldn't the Chinese? Why should we be against Chinese development? Why should we make it into an issue of competition? Everything is always competition. Why don't we get to more cooperation with Chinese development in India, development in other poor countries, etc. So there's a lot of assumptions without my talking anymore, which I've said enough, that are just wrong, that you guys are making.
Karen.
Yeah, thank you. So what I was trying to describe is that if we're absent, the world does not, as I said, organize itself to reflect the values that you are describing of peace and cooperation. And indeed, what we see is intensive competition. And I would like to see us be interested in supporting young scientists in the very same way that the Chinese are interested. That was my point. It wasn't that they shouldn't, it's that we should. We're not showing that we are looking out in the future and organizing ourselves to support innovation in a way that will allow us to continue to provide jobs and opportunities for the American people. And the same challenges present themselves in Europe. So that was the logic of my argument.
Karen?
My response would be that I think we in this room could have a very active debate about specific policies the U.S. has pursued and whether those were effective, just, whether they were in line with the values we've articulated. So I think you can have a big debate about that. And that's actually what I want us to protect. I want to protect a way of life that leave space for vibrant debate and an active citizenry. And I also want to live in a place where it's a rule of law that determines my ability to have that freedom of speech and freedom of action. And, when I think about the sweep of world history, the past 70 years, I would argue, are anomalous. And the world as a whole has achieved, I mean, when you think about the hundreds of millions of people that have been lifted out of poverty around the world over these past 7 decades, there's been a lot of good things that's happened over these past 7 decades, as well as some things that maybe we don't think are so good, or where there'd be disagreement on that. And the thing that has made these past 7 decades anomalous, I would argue, has been the role the U.S. has played in the world. So that's why I expressed some concern about what happens if the U.S. doesn't play that role anymore. And we can have a debate about that. But my argument is not based on specific policies. It's been based on a dominant power in the system espousing values which, even though it hasn't always lived up to those, has done better than any other, I would say, benign hegemon in the history of the world as we know it.
Other questions? Yes, in the second row.
Thank you. Philippe Lecourt, Belfer Center. 2 questions, one on Europe and one on China. On Europe, Karen, I'm wondering whether, if I can continue your sort of half full glass narrative, if we could assume the Europeans are able to put together their own policies and a better defense, which has been sort of criticized by the US for, I mean, the Europeans have been criticized for not doing enough. Isn't it a good moment for them to do this and to show that they can actually do it? I mean, this summit is about the future of Europe. It's not about transatlantic relations, by the way.
This panel is about transatlantic relations.
Okay, fine. It's not. Sorry, I missed the morning. My fault. My mistake. On China, which Professor Nye addressed, and something I'm trying to follow closely. What can we actually do to cooperate among Europeans and the United States? Concretely, I mean, it's all very nice to want to have a discussion, but on what? On what can we actually have a dialogue on China's global rise? Because that's what you were addressing.
I'll give an example to you. It's a very concrete example. As the climate has warmed and the pathways through the Arctic have become more accessible to ships, we have seen a huge uptick in Chinese traffic up in the Arctic region. And our Scandinavian allies have come to the United States to our official channels and said, what should we do about the fact that there's so much more of a Chinese presence? This is obviously not territory which China is contiguous to. And they're seeking to buy up a lot of real estate. What should our collective stance be about this? So I'm going to extrapolate from that to say, if we had a meaningful dialogue with our European allies about the question, we're liberal democracies, again, we're open for business, we're interested in trade, what should we do about Chinese investment that could be of strategic significance? If the Chinese want to buy rare earth mineral mines, up in the Arctic region. Is that a good thing? It's beneficial to the economy of the country that they might buy it from, but it could be damaging to our shared interests. That kind of conversation, looking at collective interests and the cumulative evidence of what the Chinese are interested in acquiring, could be beneficial to us, and we could develop a shared approach that would help us together to be stronger than if we stand alone. And you can extrapolate further from that.
And Philippe is incredibly knowledgeable on transatlantic relations and European work on China. But to your question about Europe, too, Philippe, I'm someone who thinks more Europe is a good thing. So if there's a silver lining about this current moment, it might be that the fact that the U.S. is not as present in the relationship with Europe as it has been in the past, if that can create political will in Europe for Europe to do more, and you pointed to the defense area, I think that's a good thing. And, you know, we talked earlier about how the U.S. has long beat the drum on European spending more on defense. I don't think Europeans are ever going to do that because the U.S. is asking them to. They will spend more on defense or step up what they're doing together on defense if they see it as in their interest. And let's remember that the NATO decision that took place in 2014 at the Wales Summit, this was before Donald Trump was president of the United States, it was the Europeans saying, we want to meet the 2% target by 2024 because we perceive a threat from a newly aggressive Russia on our eastern border. So I think it's all to the good if the Europeans do more, whether it's in the defense field or in the trade field or in whatever area you point to.
We've run out of time, but I might just quickly add a point or two on this, which is Europe and China are actually working together in ways that are very helpful on climate. I mean, the United States is the odd one out, and we have dropped out. What's interesting is if you compare Copenhagen, where China was the spoiler, to Paris in 2015, where basically you had a comity of Europe, U.S., and China under superb French leadership. That was an example of great success. And then the U.S. became the dropout and the spoiler. So let's hope that the Chinese and the Europeans continue, and let's hope they keep a seat warm for the Americans for some point in the future. So that's an example, a positive example of Europe-China cooperation. A second example would be, which one I already mentioned, which is on the law of the sea. Europe has a strong interest. They constantly talk about rules-based systems. How much has Europe done on the law of the sea, where China has defied a tribunal which met at The Hague? How much has Europe done about that? Not much, because they don't want to alienate China on trade issues. So there's an example. First example I gave you, Europe picked up the ball. Second example I gave you, Europe dropped the ball. A third example, which is still in play, is rules on cyber. Under the UN group of government experts, Europeans and Americans and Chinese and Russians cooperated on beginning of setting up a set of rules for managing cyber conflict. That broke down this summer. The GGE was unable to reach a report in 2017, although in 2015 they did reach a report which Obama and Xi Jinping took to the G20. It was ratified in the G20. So there's a case where U.S., Europe, and China have cooperated successfully, but where it's broken down. So I've given you 3 examples, and I'm sure there are many, many more, but it's not a null set. In any case, I apologize that we are out of time. There are lots of issues, and we're not going to solve them this afternoon, but maybe with some of the thoughts that have been stimulated by these 2 excellent speakers, you are going to solve them because your minds have been stimulated by them. So please thank both of you.